Good Wednesday to everyone. Just a reminder, we do have a quiz on Friday. Tomorrow we will be doing a booket for in class tomorrow to review for the quiz. So be sure to study that study guide. But let's talk about some famous leaders and reformers and some famous events in U.S. history. So we're going to go over some vocabulary words, but before we do, by the end of today's class, you're going to be able to answer the following questions. Why were Spanish missions originally built? And I'm pretty sure you guys should be able to answer that because this is just a review. What did Roger Williams believe and that became an amendment? What was Paul Revere remembered for saying? What was Phyllis Willis? What made Phyllis Willis unique being a slave? Whose right did Susan B. Anthony fight for? And what was the reason of first European immigration began? And what was the largest purchase of land in U.S. history? So that's a lot of questions, and we're going to get through all of it. But by the end of it, you'll be able to answer all those. All right, so the vocabulary words. Reform, to make better, to change. We've talked about reformers before whenever we were talking about the anti-slavery movement. So that word should be pretty much in your vocabulary, and you should understand what that word means. Reformer is a person who works for change. So if you understand reform, you should understand reformer. Culture is the beliefs, social forms, and traits of a racial, religious, or social group. So that just basically means I'm Italian, so my beliefs are different than someone who grew up in Germany and that is German. That's all that means. Some leader work to shape the culture. That's different. We're talking about the environment at that place. Like if you go to a job and your culture is everybody works hard, everybody does a good job, everybody wants to be on, make sure the job is done right, and everybody will help everybody. That's a culture also. Immigrant, to move forward to a foreign country. Again, guys, this is another word that we've done before. Immigration, immigrate. We've all talked about this. We talked about it during the California Gold Rush. We talked about the Europeans coming over originally to North America. We talked about the Spaniards coming over and coming into Mexico and things like that. So we've learned about the word immigrate. Immigration wave is just a large group of immigrants moving at the same time. We've talked about this also during the California Gold Rush. Secession is given rights over land. That just basically means I give up this land, I give up something to another person. All right. So famous leaders and reformers and famous events covers your government strand and your topic, civic participation and skills. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is reformers and cultural leaders. And whenever you watch do your required reading today, make sure you watch the video in the reading. So after you do that, you're going to be able to answer this question. Why were the first 9 missions established in California? It was to teach about Native American beliefs. Again, guys, that is not something new. That is something that we should already know what missions in California were built for, because we've already covered that. So famous reformers, we got Junipero Serra, Roger Williams, and Horace Mann. So let's learn a little bit about different ones. So Junipero Serra was a Spanish priest. He established 9 missions in California. Missions had a purpose, and it was to convert natives to being Catholic. And that is nothing new, right? We knew that was the mission's purpose from way back when we were talking about Mexico and California, rule of California. Roger Williams, he was a religious leader. He wanted separation from the Catholic Church. He wanted religious freedom. He was banned in Massachusetts because of it. So actually, because he spoke out and said, listen, I want to have religious freedom. I want to be able to choose my own religion. They actually kicked him out of the state or the colony. He settled in Rhode Island, and he was in favor of separation of church and state. That is now an amendment. So this, Roger Williams was in favor of separation of church and state, which became part of the First Amendment. Educational reformer was Horace Mann. He wanted education for everyone. It didn't matter who you were, what you looked like, what you did for a living. Everybody he believed needed to be educated. He set a standard to follow in Massachusetts, and he visited every school in Massachusetts to make sure that that standard that he believed in and that he put in place was being followed by that school. So, do you remember who was in favor of separation of church and state? Was it Sarah, Mann, or Williams? And of course, that was Roger Williams, who was in favor of separation of church and state. So now let's learn about some famous cultural leaders some more. We're going to talk about Paul Revere, Phyllis Wheatley, and Susan B. Anthony. So Paul Revere, he's the most famous for the warning, the British are coming. So anytime you hear about the Revolutionary War, you hear about Paul Revere riding through town yelling, the British are coming, the British are coming, the British are coming. And that was a way that he was able to allow the Americans to know the British were coming to attack, and they were able to defend themselves. He was also part of the Sons of Liberty, which was a secret society, and it believed in the protection of rights of colonists. Phyllis Wheatley was born in Africa and kidnapped into slavery, but she was taught to read and write by her slave owners. She actually had her poetry published, and she was able to read her poem in person to George Washington. She believed in patriotism and greatness of America. And here's the big thing about Phyllis Wheatley. She was actually freed from slavery. So they actually gave her freedom, which was very rare. And it barely ever happened to a slave. Before the Civil War, slaves usually never got freed. Susan B. Anthony. Now, she is a social reformer. She fought for women's rights. So, again, that's something to keep in mind. She fought for women's rights. She was a writer, speaker, and a teacher. She was an abolitionist, which meant that she was against slavery. And she co founded the National Women's Suffrage Association. And she wanted the equal voting rights for women. And if you remember, we talked about Susan B. Anthony whenever we were talking about the people from Ohio, even though she wasn't from Ohio. She co-founded the National Women's Suffrage Association with the person from Ohio, and they based it out of near Youngstown, Ohio. So European immigration, this is one of the major immigrations that happened during the United States history. It happened twice, once in the 17th century, and that was to find religious freedom. Remember, guys, that was the big thing. They did not want to have to live under the king's rule over in England, Great Britain. So they wanted to come to America. So in the 17th century, that's why there was a big European immigration. They wanted to find religious freedom. Again, it happened in the 19th century for economic opportunities. That means getting jobs and just having a better life. So do you remember who is most famous for saying the British are coming? Was it Susan B. Anthony, Thomas Jefferson, or Paul Revere? Remember, guys, that was Paul Revere. He rode on a horse through town, and it said, the British are coming, the British are coming, the British are coming. Who was freed from slavery and read a poem to George Washington? Was it Susan B. Anthony, Phyllis Wheatley, and Thomas Jefferson? Well, we know it wasn't Thomas Jefferson because of the fact of he wrote the Declaration of Independence, so we know that he wouldn't be able to. He wouldn't have been freed from slavery. And we know Susan B. Anthony was somebody who fought for women's rights. So it has to be Phyllis Wheatley. So again, now here's the same question. Who fought for women's rights? And that was Susan B. Anthony. I just told you guys right there before. Susan B. Anthony fought for women's rights. So now we're going to talk a little about some events that occurred in the United States. So the Louisiana Purchase, that was a largest purchase of land. As you can see here, the United States was all over here at this point. It was all right through here. All this was the United States, including Florida. And the Louisiana Purchase gave us all this land right through here. Gave us all this land that is white. So it was $15 million to France and doubled the size of the United States, and it created 15 states. So this occurred in 1803, but this was the largest purchase of land in U.S. history. Okay, largest purchase of land. So now, out of the Louisiana Purchase, there was a famous American leader, and that would be Meriwether Lewis. And the Lewis and Clark expedition was in charge of leading an expedition of the Louisiana Purchase land. So it was their job to find out what the United States bought. But he was also a captain in the U.S. Army and the Revolutionary War. So Meriwether Lewis was part of the expedition that went part of the expedition through the Louisiana Purchase lands. And that was called the Lewis and Clark expedition. Again, this is another one, the Mexican cessation. We were talking about this a little bit yesterday about the Spanish-American War and the Mexican-American War, how Mexico lost half of its land. But basically they just sold it to the United States for $15 million after they lost. So again, this was Mexico right through here. This was all Mexico. And after the war, the United States bought that for $15 million, and that became part of the United States. So I'm not going to go over the yes or no stuff today, just because of the fact that we are going to do a book it tomorrow about it. So I will get to your homework, and I'm trying something a little bit different today. So I need you guys to let me know how it works, to see if I can pull it in for next semester. So the first things you got to do is read Famous Leaders and Reformers. Remember, you do not have to do the required reading, or you do not have to do the assignments in the reading. Read Famous Events. You're not required to do the assignments in the reading. Brain Pop, John Adams. And then this is something new that I'm trying today, and let me know how it works. Homework for Edpuzzle, Louisiana Purchase. You're going to sign in using Canvas or Google. If it gives you an option for Google, sign in using Google. Okay. You should not need a code. You should not need to do anything. You just go into your assignments under today, under the modules, and it should be there. All right. Study your quiz study guide. Remember, there's a quiz on Friday. This quiz study guide goes away Friday morning at 6:55 a.m. And outside of that, guys, I hope you have a wonderful Wednesday, and I will see everybody tomorrow.